Good evening, everyone. Tonight's story takes us back to the age when science first dared to question the boundary between life and death. A time when brilliant, desperate men believed that lightning itself might hold the secret to resurrection. Before we begin today's video, I could really use your help. We've noticed the channel's reach has dipped a little, and one of the best ways you can support us is by subscribing. It's quick, completely free, and it helps us carry on bringing you new and fascinating stories. Your support truly means the world to us, and together we can keep this channel growing. Thank you ever so much. Now, let's get on with today's story. If you enjoy these late night tales, please give the video a like and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow, and write in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. I always love seeing who joins us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe switch on a quiet fan for that soft background hum, and let's begin our journey into the strange history of bringing the dead back to life. I write this by candlelight, as I wrote my first medical observations 40 years ago, when the century was young and we truly believed that electricity might be the very breath of God made visible. The flame flickers now as it did then, casting the same shadows across my hands, though these hands are older, steadier perhaps, and carry the weight of what they once attempted. My name is of no consequence. I was a physician's assistant in Edinburgh during those years, when the anatomical theatres hummed with a fervour that was half science, half prayer. What I witnessed in those cold stone rooms beneath the university, what I participated in with trembling fingers and racing heart, has never left me. I set it down now not for absolution, I am past seeking that, but because the truth of those days deserves to be remembered as it truly was. Neither Gothic fancy nor simple scholarly pursuit, but something far more troubling and profoundly human. We thought we were reaching for knowledge. We were reaching for resurrection. The year was 1818 when I first entered Professor Aldworth's laboratory, though my education in the mysteries of galvanism had begun somewhat earlier, in the public lectures that drew crowds as diverse as any theatre audience. Ladies in silk sat beside working men in wool, all united in their fascination with the new science of animal electricity. I was 22 years of age, recently arrived from a village in Perthshire, where my father had practiced country medicine with herbs and humility. He had saved what little he could to send me to Edinburgh, believing that modern medicine would open doors his simpler arts could not. I remember the first demonstration I attended. Professor Aldworth stood before an audience of perhaps 200 souls, in a lecture hall that smelled of damp wool, coal smoke and something sharper, the acrid tang of chemicals whose names I had yet to learn. Upon the table before him lay what he called a preparation, a term I would come to know as the polite veil we drew over our work. It was the vessel left behind by a young man, no older than myself, who had met his end by drowning in the Firth 3 days prior. The professor was a man of perhaps 50 years, tall and spare, with the kind of face that seemed carved from the same grey stone as the university itself. His voice carried to the furthest benches without strain, measured and calm, as though he were discussing the weather rather than the fundamental nature of existence. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "we stand at the threshold of understanding life itself. Not as a mystery, not as a miracle, but as a phenomenon observable, measurable, and perhaps, in time, controllable." He gestured to his apparatus, a voltaic pile of his own construction, copper and zinc plates stacked with cloth soaked in brine, wires extending like nervous tendrils to the form upon the table. The gaslight caught the metal surfaces, making them gleam like something precious. "The ancients believed the soul departed at the final breath," he continued. "But what if breath is merely the visible sign of something more fundamental? What if life itself is electrical in nature, a current that flows through the machinery of flesh, and which, given the proper stimulus, might be induced to flow again?" A murmur rippled through the audience. The woman beside me gripped her reticule tighter. I leaned forward, my medical text forgotten in my lap. Aldworth attached the wires to the vessel's arms with a precision that suggested long practice. When he activated the pile, the effect was immediate and extraordinary. The arms rose slowly as though the person were waking from sleep. The fingers extended, curled, extended again. The jaw worked soundlessly. For perhaps 10 seconds, though it felt like an age, we watched motion, where there should have been only stillness. Then it ceased. The arms lowered, the fingers relaxed, the profound quiet returned. But in those 10 seconds, every person in that hall had witnessed something that challenged everything we believed about the boundaries between one state and another. Some wept, others sat in stunned silence. A clergyman in the third row stood and departed, his footsteps echoing in the hush. I remained in my seat long after the crowd had dispersed, staring at the table, at the form now covered with a sheet, at the apparatus that had briefly commanded what we all feared and fled from. That night, I could not sleep. I kept seeing those fingers curl and uncurl, kept hearing the professor's voice. Perhaps, in time, controllable. Within the week, I had applied to be his assistant. The interview took place in his private laboratory, a vaulted chamber beneath the medical school that had once been a wine cellar. The walls wept with moisture despite the coal stove that struggled against the November cold. Along one wall stood glass-fronted cabinets, containing instruments whose purpose I could only guess at. Gleaming forceps and saws, graduated cylinders, coils of copper wire, jars of coloured liquids. Upon the central table lay several notebooks, their pages dense with diagrams and calculations in the professor's precise hand. Aldworth studied me with eyes that missed nothing. "You are young," he observed. "Why do you seek this work? The pay is modest, the hours are long, and the subject matter disturbs many of a sensitive disposition." I'd prepared an answer about advancing medical knowledge, about the privilege of studying with a man of his reputation. But standing there in that cold room, I found myself speaking a different truth. "My sister died when I was 14 years old," I said. "She was 12. A fever took her in the space of 3 days. I watched my father sit beside her bed, helpless despite all his learning. He had treatments for dozens of ailments, but when it truly mattered, he could do nothing but hold her hand and pray. I want to understand why. I want to know what leaves us and where it goes, and whether—" I faltered. Aldworth waited. "Whether it must always leave," I finished quietly. The professor regarded me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "An honest answer, and perhaps the only answer that truly matters. Yes, Mr. Crawford, I will take you on. But understand this. What we do here is not popular. It is not comfortable. We work with what others prefer to keep hidden in the earth. The church considers us blasphemers. Many of our medical colleagues think us charlatans or worse, and yet the work continues because some questions are too important to leave unasked, regardless of who condemns the asking." He extended his hand. I took it. "We begin tomorrow at 6 o'clock in the morning," he said. "Dress warmly. The work is cold." That first morning I arrived in darkness to find the laboratory already illuminated by gaslight and candles. Aldworth was preparing his apparatus, checking connections, consulting his notebooks. He looked up at my entry. "Good. You are prompt. Promptness matters in this work. Our materials do not keep long, and timing is everything." He gestured to a white cloth covering a form upon the table. I understood without being told what lay beneath. "Today you will observe and assist as needed," he said. "Ask questions if you must, but do so quietly. This is not a public lecture. This is the work itself." He drew back the cloth, and I saw for the first time what would become familiar in the weeks ahead, the vessel left behind by someone who had lately walked and breathed and thought. This had been a man of perhaps 30 years, his features still bearing the stamp of whoever he had been. The attendants had cleaned and positioned the form with care, arms at sides, head tilted slightly back. "A carter," Aldworth said, noting my gaze, "crushed beneath his wagon 2 days past when the horse took fright. He has a widow and 3 children. The widow signed the papers herself she could write, which made matters simpler. She understood that permitting this might spare others the same loss. I had not considered the families, the permissions, the paperwork that preceded the moment of experiment. It made everything more real, more weighted. Aldworth began his preparations with the methodical care of a craftsman. He positioned his voltaic pile at the head of the table, checked each connection in his array of wires and metal contacts. He had me fetch specific instruments from the cabinets, teaching me their names and purposes, the galvanometer for measuring current, the electrodes of varying sizes, the insulated probes. We begin with small applications, he explained, to assess the remaining vitality of the muscular system. The electrical nature of life does not vanish instantly. It fades like warmth from cooling metal. If we can map that fading, understand its patterns, we may learn to slow it, to halt it, perhaps even to reverse it. He attached electrodes to the vessel's right arm and activated the circuit. The forearm flexed smoothly, fingers closing into a fist. He noted the observation in his book. Strong response, minimal decay. Over the next 2 hours, he worked systematically arms, legs, shoulders, jaw. Each response was noted, each measurement recorded. I fetched and carried, adjusted apparatus, held instruments steady. The work was meticulous, almost tedious. This was not the dramatic demonstration of the public lecture, but the patient accumulation of data. Yet throughout it all I remained acutely aware that this had been a person. Those hands had held reins, earned wages, touched his wife's face. That mouth had laughed and cursed and spoken his children's names. Now it merely responded to electrical stimulus, no more animated than a mechanical puppet. When we reached the facial applications, Aldworth paused and looked at me directly. "This troubles many observers," he said. "If you need to step away, do so without shame." I shook my head. I'd come here to learn, and learning requires endurance. He attached the electrodes to specific points around the eyes and mouth. When he activated the circuit, the effect was startling. The face contorted into what might have been rage, or anguish, or something between. One eye opened part-way. The mouth drew back in something like a smile or snarl. I felt my stomach turn, but kept my feet planted. "Merely the contraction of muscle fibers," Aldworth said quietly. "No more meaningful than the twitch of a frog's leg in Galvani's experiments. And yet..." He deactivated the circuit and made his notes. When he looked up again, his expression held something I had not seen before. Doubt, perhaps, or weariness. And yet it resembles expression so closely that we cannot help but read intention into it. This is the difficulty of our work, Mr. Crawford. We must see clearly what is before us, not what our hearts wish to see. We worked until midday, when the responses began to fade markedly. Aldworth recorded the final observations, then carefully covered the form once more. "The attendants will come for him shortly," he said. "His widow will have him back for burial this afternoon. She made me promise we would treat him with respect. I believe we have honoured that promise." He began cleaning his instruments, and I assisted, learning the proper care of each piece. The work was sombre, meditative. Outside I could hear the sounds of the university footsteps, voices, the everyday business of life continuing. "You did well today," Aldworth said as we finished. "Many cannot manage even observation. You will do as an assistant." It was not effusive praise, but coming from him it felt like much. Over the following months I learned the rhythms of the work. We received perhaps 1 or 2 suitable subjects each week, those whose families had consented, whose ends had been recent and relatively clean, whose flesh might still respond to our investigations. Each required the same methodical approach: preparation, systematic testing, careful documentation. I learned to set up the voltaic piles, to calculate proper voltages for different tissues, to read the galvanometer's needle. I learned which instruments were needed for which procedures, how to arrange a workspace efficiently, how to dispose properly of the materials we used. I became, in short, proficient in the mechanics of galvanic research. But I learned something else as well, something Aldworth never spoke of directly, but which pervaded every hour we spent in that cold laboratory. I learned the weight of working at the boundary between states. Each form upon our table represented not merely a scientific specimen, but a rupture in the fabric of some family's life. A husband who would not return home, a brother who would speak no more, a mother whose chair would remain empty. We worked with their permission, but permission does not erase grief. Sometimes I wondered what they imagined we did in this basement laboratory. Did they picture us seeking some great cure, some method to prevent others from suffering similar loss? Did they understand the true nature of our experiments, that we were not preventing anything, merely studying what had already occurred? The winter of 1819 brought unusually harsh weather. The laboratory grew so cold that we worked in our greatcoats, our breath visible in the gaslight. On a January evening, After a particularly long session, Aldworth invited me to his rooms above the laboratory to warm ourselves and take a modest supper. His quarters were spartanly furnished, but lined with books, medical texts, philosophical treatises, volumes on natural philosophy and electrical theory. A fire burned in the grate, and the sudden warmth after the day's cold felt like a physical blessing. As we ate bread and cheese and drank hot wine, Aldworth surprised me by asking about my family, my childhood in Perthshire, my father's practice. I told him of growing up watching my father tend to the villagers' ailments, of learning to compound simple medicines, of the rhythms of country doctoring where everyone knew everyone and medical care was as much about comfort as cure. "Your father sounds like a good man," Aldworth said, the old school of medicine observation, experience, a gentle hand. There is value in that approach, though it reaches its limits quickly. He stared into his wineglass, swirling the dark liquid. "I was trained in much the same way," he continued. "My father was a physician in Glasgow. I apprenticed with him, learned the traditional methods, believed I was well prepared for practice. Then, during an outbreak of fever in 1795, I watched 70 people perish in the space of 6 weeks. Children, adults, elderly, it made no distinction. I bled them, purged them, tried every remedy in my books. Nothing stopped it. They simply faded, one after another, until the fever had burned itself out." He fell silent for a moment. That was when I understood that all our medicines, all our learning, were largely theatre. We were barely more effective than prayer. Oh, we could set bones, stitch wounds, perhaps assist in childbirth, the mechanical matters. But the deeper processes, the actual mechanisms of life and its cessation, we understood nothing. We were still in the Dark Ages, only with fancier instruments. "But galvanism offers a path forward," I ventured. "Perhaps. Or perhaps it merely offers us a different flavour of ignorance." He smiled slightly at my expression. "Do not misunderstand me, Mr. Crawford. I believe this work is essential, but I have been studying electrical responses in the vessels of the departed for 9 years now, and I am no closer to understanding what truly departs when someone ceases. I can make muscles contract, can produce the semblance of breath, can even generate what looks remarkably like consciousness for brief moments. But something is missing. The spark I generate with my batteries seems to move the machinery, but it does not restore the animating principle." "You think there is something beyond the electrical current?" I asked. "Something we cannot measure?" "I think," he said carefully, "that we may be attempting to kindle a fire without understanding what fuel it requires. Or I think we may be philosophers pretending to be scientists, seeking confirmation for beliefs we already hold. The truth is, I no longer know what I think. I only know I cannot stop searching." He poured more wine for both of us. "Why do you continue?" I asked. It was perhaps presumptuous, but the wine and the warmth had loosened my tongue. "Because I saw my father sit helpless beside my mother's bed when the consumption took her," he said quietly. "Because I have sat helpless beside too many beds myself. Because somewhere in understanding what departs, we might learn how to make it stay longer. And because..." He paused, choosing his words with care. "Because I have seen moments, Mr. Crawford, brief flashes during our experiments, when I could have sworn that something looked back at me, not mere muscular spasm, not reflex, something that seemed to see." A chill ran through me despite the fire's warmth. "You believe they can return?" I asked. "I believe I have seen them return," he said. "For seconds only, perhaps less. But I have seen eyes focus where they should not focus, seen fingers move with intention rather than spasm, heard once something that might have been an attempt at speech. The question is not whether return is possible. The question is whether we can sustain it, extend it, make it more than a momentary flicker." "And do you think we can?" He was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. "I think we must try," he said finally. "Because if we do not, all the knowledge dies with us, and the next generation must begin again from darkness. But I will tell you something I have told no one else. There are nights when I lie awake and wonder whether we should, whether some boundaries exist for reasons we do not yet comprehend, whether in reaching across that veil we might grasp something we are not meant to hold. He stood abruptly as though shaking off the mood. "Forgive me. The wine makes me philosophical." "Come, let me show you something." He led me to his desk and opened a locked drawer, withdrawing a leather-bound journal. "This is not my official record," he said. "It is my private observations, things too uncertain, too anomalous, too troubling to include in the reports I submit to the Royal Society. I want you to read it, Mr. Crawford. Not tonight, but when you have time to consider it carefully. It may help you understand what we are truly attempting here." He handed me the journal. It was surprisingly heavy. "If anything should happen to me," he continued, "if my experiments should reach a conclusion I do not survive, I want you to have this. You will know what to do with it." "Professor, surely." "I am in good health, and I do not anticipate any dramatic occurrence," he said with a slight smile. "But we work with powerful forces, and accidents can happen. Consider it simply a precaution." I took the journal home that night and read it by candlelight in my modest lodgings. What I found there both fascinated and disturbed me. Aldworth had documented cases that went far beyond simple muscular response. There were detailed accounts of experiments where the vessels had shown what he termed complex purposive behavior, sustained movements that suggested coordination, attempts to sit upright, fingers that seemed to reach or grasp with intention rather than reflex. In one case from 1816, a young woman who had drowned had, under sustained galvanic stimulus, opened her eyes and appeared to track Aldworth's movement across the room for nearly 30 seconds before the response ceased. But most troubling were his notes on what he called the moment of return. In several experiments, he described an instant when the vessel seemed to transition from inert matter, responding to stimulus, into something that appeared, however briefly, to be aware. He had documented changes in breathing pattern, facial expressions that seemed responsive to environment, and in 3 cases, sounds that might have been attempts at vocalization. In the margins, he had written questions. What returns? The same that departed. If so, what is its experience? If aware, is it suffering? And later, if we succeed in sustaining return, are we obligated to do so, or obligated to prevent it? The final entry stopped my breath. January 3rd, 1819. The vessel was that of a gentleman of education aged 42 who expired following a riding accident. Under sustained high-voltage stimulus, full consciousness appeared to return for approximately 90 seconds. The eyes opened and focused clearly. Breathing resumed without mechanical stimulus. The right arm raised and the hand grasped my wrist with considerable strength. The mouth worked, and though no words emerged, the expression was one of unmistakable terror. I maintained the current, believing duration to be essential to understanding. The grip on my wrist tightened painfully. The eyes, which had been merely frightened, became, I can only describe it as desperate, pleading. The mouth continued working, and I am convinced, though I cannot prove, that the person was attempting to speak, to convey something of urgent importance. After 90 seconds, the response collapsed suddenly and completely. When I examined the vessel afterwards, I found the electrical burns where the electrodes had contacted the skin were severe, far worse than usual. I'd been so focused on duration that I had not modulated the voltage properly. I believe I hurt him. I believe he was conscious, aware, suffering, and I maintained the current because I valued my observations over his mercy. God forgive me. I do not know whether I brought him back or called him back, and I do not know which possibility is more terrible. I closed the journal with trembling hands. Outside my window, Edinburgh slept under a cold sky. I thought of all the forms I had seen upon Aldworth's table, all the times I had watched muscles twitch and fingers curl. Had I witnessed brief consciousness in those movements? Had suffering looked at me through those unseeing eyes? The question that haunted me then, haunts me still, was whether Aldworth's experiments represented the highest reach of science or the deepest failure of compassion. Were we saving humanity from grief, or were we disturbing a mercy we did not understand? I did not sleep that night. The next morning, I returned to the laboratory, determined to speak with Aldworth about what I had read. But when I arrived, I found him already deep in preparation for the day's work. and his manner discouraged personal discussion. "We have a fresh subject," he said briskly, "a woman of middle years, passed overnight from what appears to be apoplexy. The family has given permission, though they were reluctant. The husband is a minister, and he has asked that we conduct our work with particular respect." I assured him we would. As the morning progressed, I found myself watching Aldworth with new attention. Every adjustment of voltage, every notation in his book, every word of measured observation, I wondered what he was thinking, what he was remembering. Did he see that terrified face from his journal entry? Did he question, as I now did, what right we had to touch these boundaries? The woman upon our table had been someone's wife, someone's mother perhaps. The minister husband had kissed that face, held those hands, heard words of love from those lips. Now we prodded and measured and electrified, seeking responses that would mean nothing to her family and everything to our theories. When Aldworth applied stimulus to the facial muscles, producing an expression that might have been surprise or shock, I felt suddenly ill. I set down the instruments I was holding and stepped back from the table. Aldworth looked up. "Are you unwell?" "I need air," I managed. "Forgive me." I left the laboratory and climbed the stairs to the courtyard, where weak winter sunlight struggled through grey clouds. Students passed in small groups, laughing, arguing about some point of anatomy or chemistry. Their voices seemed to come from another world, a world where death was still abstract, still something that happened to other people, still far enough away to permit casual discussion. I had thought I understood what we were doing. I had thought it was noble, essential, the advancement of human knowledge. But reading Aldworth's private journal had shifted something fundamental. We were not merely studying the mechanisms of life and its cessation. We were disturbing something that might best be left undisturbed. We were reaching across a boundary that existed, perhaps for good reason. And yet, if we could truly bring someone back, not for seconds, but sustainably, completely, how many wives would be spared widowhood? How many children would keep their fathers? How many futures would be preserved that now were cut short? Was the risk of temporary suffering during experimentation not justified by the possibility of ending so much permanent suffering? I stood in that cold courtyard, torn between horror and hope, between doubt and belief. Aldworth found me there perhaps 10 minutes later. He stood beside me in silence for a moment, then spoke quietly. "You read the journal?" It was not a question. "Yes," I said. "And now you question whether we should continue?" "I question whether I should continue," I corrected. "You must make your own determination." He nodded slowly. "That is fair. You have that right, and I will think no less of you if you choose to withdraw. This work is not for everyone." "Do you believe what you wrote?" I asked. "That he was conscious? That he suffered?" Aldworth was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight I had not heard before. "I believe that for 90 seconds, something inhabited that vessel that had not been there moments before. Whether it was the original consciousness, or some new thing created by the electrical current, or merely my own desperate interpretation of random responses, I cannot say with certainty. But his eyes saw me, Mr. Crawford. They saw me, and they were afraid." "Then how can we continue?" I asked. "How can we risk causing such fear, such pain?" "Because the alternative is to abandon everyone who dies before their time to the grave without question," Aldworth said quietly. "My mother was 39 years old when the consumption took her. She had strength until the very end, intelligence, will, everything except healthy lungs. If I could have brought her back, if I could have given her more time, would it not have been worth the attempt? Even if the attempt caused momentary distress?" "But you cannot bring them back," I said. "Not truly, not sustained. You said yourself it lasted only seconds." "Not yet," he said. "But every experiment teaches us something. Every observation adds to our understanding. We are building towards something, Mr. Crawford. I feel it. We stand at the very edge of a profound discovery. To turn back now, because of squeamishness, because of fear, would that not be the greater crime?" I wanted to believe him. God help me. I wanted so desperately to believe that what we were doing served some higher purpose, that the troubling moments were merely the price of progress, that we stood on the threshold of something miraculous. "What do you need from me?" I asked finally. "I need you to help me push further," he said. "I need you to help me sustain the response longer, maintain consciousness past those brief flickers. I truly believe, that with proper technique, adequate voltage, correct positioning of the electrodes, we can achieve stable reanimation. But I cannot do it alone. The work requires 2 sets of hands, 2 minds working in concert." He placed a hand on my shoulder. "I will understand if you refuse, but if you agree, if you help me reach this goal, we may accomplish something that changes human existence itself. We may defeat the final quiet. We may give families back what was taken from them." I thought of my sister, dead these 8 years. I thought of my father weeping beside her bed. I thought of all the grief in the world, all the permanent loss that might, perhaps, be rendered temporary. "I will help," I said. We returned to the laboratory together. Part the second, the ascent. What followed were months of increasingly ambitious experimentation. Aldworth obtained permission from the university to expand his apparatus, to construct more powerful voltaic batteries, to access subjects more promptly after their departure. We worked longer hours, sometimes through the night, pursuing responses that lasted seconds beyond the previous attempts. I learned to read the subtle signs of consciousness returning, the change in breathing pattern, the way the eyes would shift from vacant to focused, the quality of movement that suggested intention rather than reflex. I learned to monitor multiple galvanometers simultaneously, adjusting current to different muscle groups to maintain coordination. I became, in effect, an orchestrator of electrical stimulus, conducting a symphony of voltages in pursuit of sustained animation. The work consumed us both. Aldworth grew thinner, more intense, sleeping little. He took his meals at his desk, if he remembered to eat at all. His lectures to students grew shorter and more perfunctory. All his energy, all his focus bent towards the single goal, to bring someone back and keep them back. We had moments of extraordinary progress. In March, we maintained coordinated movement in a young man for nearly 2 minutes. He sat upright, turned his head towards sounds, seemed to track our movements with his eyes. In April, a woman appeared to breathe independently for 40 seconds, her chest rising and falling without mechanical assistance. In May, we produced what might have been a word, a single syllable from a merchant's vessel that sounded remarkably like no. But we also had failures. Some vessels showed no response at all regardless of voltage. Others responded violently, with seizure-like convulsions that damaged the flesh and made further experimentation impossible. And in some cases, we produced responses so disturbing that even Aldworth paled. There was an evening in June when we worked with the form of a young clerk who had expired from a tumour of the brain. Under stimulus, his eyes opened and fixed on the ceiling, and from his throat came a sound, not a word, but a sustained exhalation that rose and fell with a rhythm eerily like sobbing. It continued for 25 seconds, that awful sound, before ceasing abruptly. Aldworth disconnected the apparatus with shaking hands. "Make a note," he said hoarsely. Strong vocalization, suggesting preserved respiratory control, duration 25 seconds. But he did not resume the experiment that night. We covered the form in silence and cleaned our instruments without speaking. As I left the laboratory, I heard that sound echoing in my mind. Not grief, perhaps, but something that sounded so like grief that the difference no longer mattered. Yet we continued. We told ourselves that these troubling moments were merely artifacts of incomplete reanimation, that once we achieved full and stable return, such distressing responses would cease. We were like climbers on a mountain who convinced themselves that the summit lies just beyond the next ridge, and then the next, and then the next. It was in July when Aldworth announced his most ambitious plan yet. "I have been corresponding with a colleague in London," he said, showing me a letter. "Dr. Erasmus Fitch. He has been conducting similar experiments, and has access to an electrical apparatus far more powerful than ours, a battery array capable of sustained high voltage. He has invited us to bring our techniques to London and attempt a joint experiment." "What sort of experiment?" I asked, though part of me already knew. A complete reanimation, Aldworth said, his eyes bright with fevered enthusiasm. Not seconds or minutes, but hours, perhaps indefinitely. Dr. Fitch believes that the issue is insufficient power, that we have been providing enough current to spark the machinery of life, but not enough to sustain its operations. With his apparatus, we might achieve true restoration. Have you considered, I said carefully, what might happen if we succeed? What do you mean? If someone returns fully with consciousness, memory, awareness, what then? Do we simply release them back to their families? Do they resume their lives? Or have they become something else, something we do not understand? Aldworth waved away my concerns. These are questions for philosophy, not science. First, we must prove that stable reanimation is possible. Then we can consider its implications. But surely... Mr. Crawford, he interrupted, with an edge to his voice I had not heard before. I have spent 9 years on this work. I have sacrificed health, reputation, the possibility of a normal practice, the respect of my colleagues. I've been called blasphemer, ghoul, resurrectionist. I've endured it all because I believe I know that we stand on the threshold of the most important discovery in human history. Dr. Fitch's apparatus offers us the opportunity to cross that threshold. I intend to seize it. The question is whether you will accompany me. I looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw a man consumed. The measured professor who had first interviewed me was gone, replaced by someone driven by an obsession that had crossed the line from dedication into something more troubling. But I also saw the grief that fueled that obsession, the memory of his mother dying too young, the accumulated weight of all the losses he had witnessed and proved helpless to prevent, and I saw myself reflected in his face. I had my own losses, my own ghosts, my own desperate hope that death might prove negotiable after all. When do we leave? I asked. We departed Edinburgh in early August, travelling by coach with our most essential instruments and notebooks. The journey took 4 days, and throughout it, Aldworth was restless, constantly reviewing his notes, sketching modifications to electrode placements, calculating voltages and durations. London overwhelmed me. After Edinburgh's grey stone dignity, the capital's noise and scale and sheer profusion of humanity felt almost violent. We lodged in rooms near Dr. Fitch's laboratory in Clerkenwell, in a district that smelled of tanneries and soapworks and coal smoke. Dr. Fitch proved to be a man of perhaps 40 years, shorter and rounder than Aldworth, with a nervous energy that expressed itself in constant motion. His laboratory was larger than Aldworth's, occupying an entire converted warehouse, and the electrical apparatus that dominated its centre was unlike anything I had seen. Tier upon tier of batteries, switches and regulators, a maze of copper wire that suggested more power than I had imagined portable. Magnificent, is it not? Fitch said proudly, as Aldworth and I stood staring. 100 voltaic cells in series, capable of delivering sustained current for hours. With this, we can maintain stimulus far beyond the brief pulses your equipment permits. The question has always been power, my friends. Insufficient power. Have you tested it? Aldworth asked. Oh yes. I have achieved responses lasting 3, sometimes 4 minutes with suitable subjects. But I lack your refined technique, your understanding of precise electrode placement for different effects. Together, I believe we can achieve something unprecedented. When can we begin? Aldworth asked. Tomorrow morning, Fitch said. I have secured a suitable subject, a gentleman of middle years who expired last evening from heart failure. The family was willing, though they know nothing of the specific nature of our work. They believe we conduct research into the electrical nature of cardiac function, which, in a sense, we do. That night, I lay awake in the strange room, listening to London's endless noise. Somewhere nearby, a man who had ceased to live lay waiting to become the subject of our most ambitious attempt yet. What were we about to do to him? And if we succeeded, if we truly brought him back to awareness, what manner of existence would we be inflicting upon him? But beneath my doubts lay the same hunger that drove Aldworth and Fitch, the desperate hope that we might undo the irreversible, that we might prove consciousness stronger than its dissolution, that we might, in effect, storm heaven and demand back what it had taken. The morning arrived grey and heavy with moisture. We assembled in Fitch's laboratory at dawn, the three of us moving through our preparations with the solemnity of priests approaching an altar. The form upon the table had been a barrister named Thomas Hartley, age 43, survived by a wife and 2 grown daughters. Fitch had obtained him through a physician friend who signed the papers without asking too many questions about our intentions. Hartley's face bore the stamp of intelligence, a high forehead, fine features, hands that spoke of penwork rather than manual labour. Looking at him, I could imagine him arguing cases in court, reading to his daughters by lamplight, sharing quiet conversation with his wife over breakfast. All those small intimacies now ended, unless we succeeded. Aldworth positioned the electrodes with extraordinary care, placing them according to a schema he had developed over months of experimentation. Major contacts at the temples, the base of the skull, over the heart. Secondary contacts along the spine, at the wrists behind the knees. A web of copper wire connected Hartley to Fitch's massive apparatus, like some strange technological cocoon. "We will begin with low voltage and increase gradually," Aldworth said, his voice tight with controlled excitement. "Mr. Crawford, you will monitor the galvanometers and call out readings. Dr. Fitch, you will control the main current. I will observe responses and direct adjustments." Fitch stood at his apparatus, hand on the main switch. "Ready when you are." Aldworth took a breath, then nodded. "Begin at 20 volts." Fitch engaged the current. The galvanometer needles trembled, then steadied. Hartley's body showed no visible response. 30 volts, Aldworth said. The fingers twitched. Nothing more. 40 volts. Now a visible contraction in the arms, a slight arch to the back. Standard responses, nothing we had not seen before. 50 volts. The eyes opened. Not the vacant opening we had sometimes produced, but a sudden snap of the lids, revealing eyes that immediately moved, scanning, seeking. The chest heaved once, twice, then settled into a rhythm that looked remarkably like natural breathing. "Hold at 50, Aldworth said quietly. "Maintain steady current." We watched, hardly breathing ourselves. Hartley's eyes continued to move, the head turning slightly from side to side. The fingers flexed and relaxed repeatedly, not with the mechanical quality of stimulus response, but with a purposiveness that suggested thought. 60 volts, Aldworth said, slowly. Fitch adjusted the current. The breathing deepened. Hartley's right hand lifted from the table, rose to perhaps 6 inches, hovered there. The fingers spread, curled, spread again, as though testing their own existence. "Magnificent," Fitch whispered. "Look at the coordination." 70 volts, Aldworth said. The hand continued to rise. Now the arm bent at the elbow, and the hand moved towards Hartley's own face, touched the cheek, the forehead, with movements that were exploratory, unmistakably conscious. And then the eyes found us. I will never forget that moment. Hartley's gaze moved from the ceiling to sweep across the laboratory and landed on Aldworth standing beside the table. The eyes focused, sharpened, and in them I saw recognition, not of Aldworth specifically, but recognition that he was seeing another person, another consciousness. The mouth opened, the jaw worked. From deep in the throat came a sound, rough, uncertain, but shaped by intention. Where? A single word, barely audible, but unmistakable. A question, a mind seeking to understand its circumstances. "Mr. Hartley," Aldworth said, his voice trembling, "you have been ill. You are recovering. Can you hear me?" The eyes remained fixed on Aldworth. The mouth worked again, and this time the word came clearer. "Cold." "Increase to 75 volts, Aldworth said. "He needs more power to maintain higher functions." Fitch adjusted the current. Immediately, Hartley's other arm rose. Now both hands were moving and the legs began to shift. He was trying to sit up. "Help him," Aldworth commanded. I moved to support Hartley's shoulders, and with surprising strength he pulled himself to a sitting position. His head swiveled, taking in the laboratory, the apparatus, the windows, the three of us watching him. The breathing was faster now, the chest rising and falling with what looked like agitation. "What?" he began, then stopped. His hands moved to his chest, feeling, exploring. "What is..." "You're safe, Mr. Hartley," Aldworth said. "You suffered a failure of the heart. We are physicians. We are helping you." But Hartley's expression was not that of a patient receiving medical care. His eyes had grown wider, moving rapidly from object to object, person to person. The hands continued their exploration, touching the wires attached to his body, following them to the apparatus, then to his own temples where the electrodes pressed against skin. "No," he said, and the word carried a weight that made my stomach clench. "No, no, this is not." "Mr. Hartley, please remain calm," Aldworth said, but there was uncertainty in his voice now. Hartley's hands went to the electrode at his temple, grasping it. I saw his intention and lunged forward. "Don't remove it," I shouted, but he had already pulled the contact free. The effect was instantaneous and horrific. His body convulsed violently, every muscle contracting at once. The remaining electrodes conducted the full current through paths they were not designed for. The smell of burning flesh filled the laboratory. Hartley's mouth opened in a scream that seemed to tear itself from some fundamental place. Not pain alone, but something deeper, more existential. "Cut the current!" Aldworth shouted. Fitch threw the switch. The scream stopped as abruptly as it had begun. Hartley collapsed backward onto the table, arms and legs splayed, chest heaving. The eyes remained open, but now they stared at nothing. For perhaps 10 seconds, none of us moved. Then Aldworth stepped forward, checking for a pulse at the throat, listening at the chest. "He has ceased again," Aldworth said quietly. "The interruption of current, the damage from the uncontrolled discharge. It was too much." Fitch had gone pale. "My God, did you see his face? Did you hear that sound?" "Disconnect the apparatus," Aldworth said heavily. "We are finished here." As I began removing the electrodes, my hands shaking, I made myself look at Hartley's face. The features were slack now, empty once more of whatever had briefly inhabited them. But I would carry forever the memory of those eyes seeing us, that mouth forming words, that hand reaching up to remove what we had inflicted upon him. He had been conscious, fully, terribly conscious, and his first act upon understanding his situation had been to try to stop it, even at the cost of his existence. We had brought him back, and he had chosen to leave again. The three of us stood in silence for a long moment. Finally Fitch spoke, his voice small. Should we try again? With different voltage, different electrode placement, we might..." "No," Aldworth said flatly. "We are done. Mr. Crawford, help me prepare him for return to his family." "But we achieved consciousness," Fitch protested. "We proved it is possible, with refinement." "Dr. Fitch," Aldworth said, and his voice carried a terrible weariness. "What did you see in his eyes?" Fitch opened his mouth, then closed it again. "I saw terror," Aldworth continued quietly. "I saw a mind returning to find itself trapped in flesh that should be at rest, tethered to machinery, surrounded by strangers. I saw a man realizing what we had done to him, and I saw him choose release over continuation." "You cannot know that," Fitch said weakly. "It could have been confusion, disorientation, the shock of revival." "He said no," I interrupted. "He looked at the wires, at the apparatus, at us, and he said no. That was not confusion. That was refusal." Aldworth removed his coat and covered Hartley's form. "We will tell the family that our research was unsuccessful. The body will show signs of our work, but we will say we attempted electrical stimulation to restart the heart, which is true, in its way." "But we were so close," Fitch said desperately. "We achieved minutes of consciousness, coordinated movement, speech. With more power, more duration, the disorientation would pass, and..." "And what?" Aldworth turned to face him. "What comes next, Dr. Fitch?" "We achieve sustained reanimation, stabilize the body, maintain consciousness indefinitely. Then what? The person lives tethered to our apparatus like a marionette to its strings, unable to survive without constant electrical current, aware of what they have become. Is that the gift we would give them? Is that the miracle we would sell to their families?" He moved closer to Fitch, his voice dropping, but losing none of its intensity. "I have spent 9 years pursuing this work. I have sacrificed everything to it. I wanted nothing more than to prove that the final quiet could be reversed, that we might restore what was taken. But I saw Thomas Hartley's eyes, Doctor. I saw what we had called back, and I understood, finally, what I should have understood long ago. Some boundaries exist, not to be crossed. Fitch looked away. You are giving up, after everything. I am accepting what should be accepted, Aldworth said. There is a difference. We wrapped Hartley in linen and arranged for his return to his family. We cleaned the laboratory in silence, disconnecting the apparatus, storing the instruments. When we finished, Fitch left without another word. His shoulders slumped, his apparatus standing silent and abandoned in the centre of the room. Aldworth and I returned to our lodgings. That night, he burned his private journal in the fireplace. I watched the pages curl and blacken, years of observations and hope reduced to ash. I thought we were on the verge of the greatest discovery in human history, he said, staring into the flames. Perhaps we were, but some discoveries should not be made. Some knowledge serves only to reveal how little we truly understand. What will you do now? I asked. I will return to Edinburgh. I will teach, practice conventional medicine, perhaps write on less ambitious subjects. I will live with what I have learned. He looked at me. And you? I think, I said slowly, that I will do the same. Though I do not know if I can practice medicine after this. How does one treat the living after working so long with those who have ceased? How does one believe in healing after attempting resurrection? You learn, Aldworth said quietly. You learn to accept limits. You learn to comfort rather than cure when cure is impossible. You learn to be present with grief rather than trying to defeat it. These are harder lessons than any medical text teaches, but they are the lessons that matter most. We sat in silence, watching the journal burn. Part the third, the return to life. I returned to Edinburgh alone. Aldworth stayed in London another week, tying up loose ends, speaking with colleagues, ensuring that word of our failed experiment spread no further than necessary. When he finally returned, he was a changed man, quieter, sadder, but also somehow lighter, as though he had set down a burden he had carried too long. He resumed his lectures with a different emphasis. Where once he had spoken of electricity as the key to understanding life itself, now he focused on its therapeutic applications, the treatment of paralysis, the stimulation of weakened muscles, the relief of certain pains. Useful work, humble work, but work that helped the living rather than disturbing those who had found rest. I took a position as assistant to a country doctor in Midlothian, a man of my father's generation who practiced the old steady medicine of observation and experience. I learned to set fractures, deliver children, lance boils, compound medicines from herbs. Small things, mortal things, but honest things. Yet I could not entirely leave behind what I had witnessed. There were nights when I would wake from dreams of Thomas Hartley's eyes, of that hand reaching for the electrode, of that single word, no. I would lie awake wondering what he had experienced in those brief minutes of consciousness. Had it been like waking from sleep, or like being torn back from somewhere else, somewhere that should not be left? I wondered too about all the others we had subjected to our experiments. The carter, the woman with apoplexy, the young clerk whose voice had sounded like sobbing. Had they too achieved moments of consciousness we had not recognized? Had they been aware, trapped, unable to communicate their distress? The thought haunted me. 2 years after the London experiment, I received a letter from Aldworth. He had married a widow his own age, a woman of sense and kindness, who knew nothing of galvanism and cared less. He had abandoned his laboratory, donated his apparatus to the university for teaching purposes, published his final paper on therapeutic applications of electricity. He was, he wrote, content. I have learned, the letter said, that the great achievement of medicine is not to defeat the final quiet, but to ease the journey toward it. I have learned that presence matters more than power, that sitting beside a bed in the last hours matters more than all the apparatus in the world. I have learned to grieve, Mr. Crawford, and to let that grief remain grief, rather than transmuting it into obsession. These are small victories, perhaps, but they are real ones, and they serve the living rather than disturbing those who should rest. He concluded, I hope you have found similar peace. If you have not, I hope you are seeking it. We reached too far, my friend. We grasped at what was never meant to be held. The mercy of existence is that some doors, once closed, remain closed. We thought we were storming heaven. We were merely disturbing the grave. I folded the letter carefully and placed it with a few other documents I had kept from those years. My original notes from Aldworth's laboratory, a sketch of his apparatus, a list of the names of those whose forms had lain upon his table. Not a large collection, but weighted with memory. In the years that followed, I built a modest practice. I married, eventually a farmer's daughter with steady hands and a practical nature. We had 3 children, all of whom survived to adulthood. I treated the expected catalogue of country ailments: fevers, injuries, difficult births, the slow decline of age. I could not save everyone. Many I watched depart despite my best efforts, but I learned to sit beside their beds, to hold hands, to speak comfort even when I could offer no cure. I learned, as Aldworth had written, to let grief be grief. Sometimes, in those quiet vigils, I would think about the fundamental question that had driven all our experiments. What departs when someone ceases? Where does consciousness go? Why does the machinery of flesh, still intact, suddenly fall still? I never found an answer. I no longer believe there is one answer, or at least not one that human understanding can grasp. We are mysteries to ourselves, and the boundaries of our existence are part of that mystery. But I came to believe something else, something that might have saved us much trouble had we understood it earlier. The boundary exists not to mock us or thwart us, but to protect us. It protects those who have finished their time from being called back to a world they have left. And it protects the living from the knowledge of what lies beyond that veil, knowledge we are not equipped to bear while we still draw breath. Thomas Hartley understood this in the moments we gave him consciousness. He saw where he was, what had been done to him, what we intended, and he chose to return to the quiet, rather than remain in our experiment. I've never been certain whether that was courage or desperation or simply clarity. Perhaps it was all 3. Epilogue: what remains? I am an old man now, writing this by candlelight as I wrote my first medical observations more than 4 decades ago. The flame flickers as it always has, casting the same shadows. But I understand shadows differently now. They are not merely absence of light, but necessary borders, definitions that give shape to what we can see. Professor Aldworth passed from this life 6 years ago, peacefully in his sleep, with his wife beside him. I attended his funeral, a small, quiet affair, attended by former students and medical colleagues who knew him only as a teacher of anatomy, a careful researcher, a man who had contributed modestly to therapeutic applications of electricity. His epitaph makes no mention of galvanism or reanimation. It reads simply, "He sought to ease suffering." It is enough. It is more than enough. Dr. Fitch continued his experiments for several years after we departed London, or so I heard through medical gossip. But he published nothing of significance and eventually retreated into obscurity. I do not know if he ever achieved what he sought. I suspect not. I hope not. The apparatus and techniques we developed have fallen into disuse, or been adapted to legitimate therapeutic purposes. The questions we asked are still asked, but in different terms, by different men. Perhaps someday, someone will find answers we could not. Perhaps someday the boundary we failed to cross will yield to greater knowledge, more refined technique, deeper understanding. But I wonder, in my old age, whether finding that answer would serve any purpose beyond satisfying curiosity. I wonder whether some questions exist, not to be answered, but to remind us of our limits, our proper place in the order of things. We are born, we live, we cease. This has been the pattern since the first human drew breath. To interrupt that pattern, even if we could, might be to interrupt something essential, something we cannot see but whose absence we would feel. I think of my sister, dead these 46 years. I think of my parents, long departed. I think of the countless patients I attended who passed beyond my ability to help. I miss them. The grief never entirely leaves. It merely becomes familiar, woven into the fabric of existence. But I no longer wish to bring them back. I no longer believe that the final quiet is an enemy to be defeated. It is simply the boundary we all approach, the doorway we all pass through, the transition from motion into stillness. And there is mercy in that transition, mercy in the fact that it is final, that it cannot be undone by those of us who remain and grieve. We did not bring them back. In our hubris and our grief, we tried, and we failed, and perhaps that failure was the true success we could have achieved. We learned how thin the veil truly was, and how merciful it is that it remains. The candle burns low now as I write these final words. Soon it will gutter and die, and I will be left in darkness until morning brings new light. This seems fitting. We live in the spaces between darkness-brief sparks of consciousness in an infinite quiet. To try to extend that spark, to try to rekindle it once extinguished, is to misunderstand the nature of light itself. Light is beautiful because it is temporary. Life is precious because it ends. And the boundary between motion and stillness, between breath and its cessation, exists not as punishment, but as mercy, the final mercy that grants rest to those whose time has concluded. Would I do it again? If I could return to those years when we stood in the laboratory with our apparatus and our ambitions, would I again attach electrodes to the vessels left behind, seeking to call back what had departed? I do not know. Even now, after all these years, after all I have learned and understood, part of me still wonders. Part of me still asks the question we could never quite abandon. What if we had succeeded? What if we had found the technique, the voltage, the precise configuration that would have brought someone fully back and kept them back? Would that have been miracle or abomination? But then I remember Thomas Hartley's eyes. I remember that hand reaching for the electrode. I remember the choice he made in the only moment of consciousness we granted him, and I think I understand. We were not meant to succeed. The boundary stands because it must stand. Some doors, once closed, serve their purpose better by remaining so. Not because what lies beyond is terrible. I make no claims about that, having no knowledge, but because the living, and those who have ceased, must be permitted to exist in their separate states. To blur that boundary is to serve neither. This is what I learned in those years when science and faith clashed over the question of life and its limits. This is what I carry with me as I approach my own ending. That curiosity is noble, but acceptance is wiser. That knowledge is valuable, but mercy is more valuable still. That the reach of human ambition will always exceed its grasp and should. We did not bring them back. We only learned how little we truly understood about the mystery we sought to master. And perhaps that is the only lesson that mattered. The candle gutters now. The flame diminishes. Soon, only darkness. And then, in time, morning. Finis. Written in the autumn of my 74th year, by one who witnessed, who participated, who learned at great cost that some boundaries exist to preserve mercy itself.